Yeah. Hello and welcome. My name is Jonathan van Immerzeel. I am a technical environment artist who worked on Lake. As you may understand, there are many different aspects and perspectives on the development of the game. As you've seen in the presentations by my colleagues, my responsibilities included building the broad strokes of the landscape, the vegetation, some of the tools and graphics as well. And those are some things I really like doing. I have a few older builds and screenshots and videos, so I'll try to cover those and hopefully dot out some of the development that went into the game. So when I was approached with the concept behind Lake, I was shown this particular image, and for me I think it instilled the same sort of gut feeling that everyone was going on. And it was described as a relaxing game where you drive around and you may talk to some people, and the prospect of building this conifer-riddled environment is what really sparked my interest. It seemed to be a rather large-scale game world, and I had some notion of the technical challenges that would go into that, and that's a challenge I really wanted to take on. Of course, next to it being set in the 80s, I wasn't alive back then, so the only recollection I have of the 80s is through movies I watched as a kid. And I really dig the 80s vibe and aesthetics, so there was a big selling point for me as well. So at the start of the project, there were still a lot of unknowns. How large was the world going to be in it? What sort of layout would we have? And especially what was going to be in it? And a natural first step was to just create a landscape with a lake and a road around it. And that kind of gave us a starting point, a feeling point, but it also created a playground for other aspects of development. But at this point it was still for me rather unclear what I was actually making or working towards. So I figured it was time to at least take a little bit direction. So I created this sketch of what the world could potentially look like, and we had a document in which every team member could submit ideas for characteristic locations, such as a diner, obviously, gas station, fishing docks, and most of them actually ended up being in the game. So I incorporated those in the map as well, and all these red dots, they represent mail addresses. Wasn't sure if those were too many, if they weren't enough, but I tried to sort of evenly distribute them along the map to make it interesting for the player. So this is what I ended up building into the actual game world itself, so we could just drive around and have a feel for the lay of the land, so to speak. But one problem that we encountered was that the world was actually quite big, and not long before that we had actually made a demo build for a convention, which just had 3 or 4 mail addresses, and we actually learned a lot from that because we knew the extent of work that would go into dialogues and camera and framing and making all these interesting locations and addresses. So we realized we were probably not going to be able to create that sort of content on this large of a scale. So a tough call was made to halve the size of the entire terrain, and technically that wasn't as easy as it sounds. So it involved just starting from scratch and throwing everything out. I was quite alright with that because it made the first attempt sort of a practice run and allowed us to do things a little differently, a little better. It did have a lot of implications on gameplay and design, because every trigger, every mail address, it had to be moved into a new position. But I think in the end it panned out really well. The world is a lot more smaller and tight-knit, so I think that was the right thing to do eventually. And this is a development process that spanned over about 1.5 years, but it was really important for us to finally converge on what the world was going to look like and its layout, so we could start, creating content around all the specific roads and polish that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what went into recreating Oregon, because to build the game world we needed building blocks. And I've personally never been to Oregon myself, so I had little clue what it looked like. And all the reference photos, they were very varied, a lot of different locations, and it was difficult to really distill the essence of Oregon, what makes Oregon Oregon. That said, the game world also needed to be a simplified version because we couldn't possibly achieve that much detail or variation. Recreating a real world location was definitely new to me. I had only created environments that were just born out of pure inspiration, didn't have much ground in the real world. So I decided to look at satellite photos of the state, and I noticed it had two distinct ecoregions. You have the forests and grasslands over here, and the desert highlands on the east side. And from this point of view, the desert highlands didn't inspire a lot of inspiration because it seemed rather barren. In reality, nothing's further from the truth. So it seemed to me that recreating a forest environment would be the most natural choice, also the most interesting, because they create this natural, closely knit and intimate settings. And secondly, trees, they create natural barriers, which is very helpful in guiding and funneling the player to the places we wanted them to go, because it's of course not an open world game. When you're delivering mail, you're always going to specific places. But Oregon has about 11 different forest types, so once again, a lot of variety made it difficult to really distill a sort of average. But one thing they all had in common, of course, was vegetation. So that seemed like a very good starting point, also well within my comfort zone. When researching the kind of vegetation that was common in Oregon, I stumbled upon this particular book, and it's something that was published by the Oregon Forestry Department, like way back in the 50s or something. And it was a means to familiarize the public with the kind of trees that grow around them. And I think it was also used in some classrooms, according to some reviews. But this book was a goldmine of information. Suddenly I knew the name of all the trees, details on the branches and leaves, how wide the trunks could get, how tall the mature trees could grow, and the common regions that they occurred in. But it seemed the dominant species in Oregon is definitely the Douglas fir. And when I say dominant, this is the distribution map of the trees, and you can see in the forested area they basically occur everywhere. So once again, that seemed like an average good starting point to go with. I set out to create them and add them to the game world, and it was a monumental milestone, especially since trees cover so much of the game world. It instantly elevated the game to a new level and gave it a certain characteristic.
What kind of fantastic trees have you got growing around here? Big, majestic.
Douglas firs.
Douglas firs.
That instantly reminded me of that particular scene in Twin Peaks. I think it was like second episode. It's essentially a city boy drives into this small American town, and the first impression he has are these majestic Douglas fir trees just spread everywhere. Yet the ground itself was still quite barren. If you look at any photos of trees along roads or a forest, you'll notice that the floor is just extremely busy. It's bustling with life, different types of plants, rotting trees, broken branches, and so forth. But we were probably unable to achieve that kind of density and variety. So the easiest step was just to add grass. Next to that, I added young and baby versions of the trees as well to sort of cover up the coverage gap. I realized there was a sort of hierarchy in the density of vegetation, so to speak, starting with trees going all the way down to the bare terrain and the grass. And there was a gap there. We didn't have any plants, we didn't have any shrubs or boulders that could fill in this gap. So I took a similar approach to trees, and I started looking up what sort of common shrubs and plants grow in Oregon. So I arrived at ferns. They're very common in forested areas. Game-wise, they also have the benefit of being quite large, so they fill up a lot of a lot of space. And here you can actually see the final ground coverage that was used in the game. It's mostly grass, ferns, a juniper shrub, and sometimes some flowers as well. And this really helped create a more detailed ground coverage on like a human scale that you could actually see when you were walking around. The result was that we had denser vegetation coverage next to all the roads, which really helped create that sort of intimate setting we were going through. And perhaps an important note is that all the vegetation is procedurally placed. It's not done by hand. That would take a huge amount of time, but that allowed me to create like specific rules. Certain plants only grow within certain areas, or they don't grow on certain slope angles, and only on specific terrain textures, for instance. I was eager to create more variety. Oregon is really a whirlpool of inspiration in that sense, and at some point I even created these sequoia trees, which Oregon is pretty well known for. But it didn't really work. The world was much smaller, and it didn't make sense if you drove through this Douglas forest and suddenly you were introduced to these gigantic sequoia trees. We kind of ran the risk of turning it into a sort of zoo or exhibition of all the different ecoregions Oregon is known for. Rocks were very similar topic to vegetation. They're very important building blocks when it comes to a terrain, because they tell the ecological story of the environment. You'll see different rocks and cliffs in deserts than you would in a forest, of course. So they really contribute to the character of the environment. But when I was looking at reference photos of cliffs and rocks in Oregon, once again, they were so varied and wildly different that it was difficult to create an average. Once again, they were very noisy and had lots of mineral deposits on it, and I did not think that would translate very well in the game world, because I wanted to avoid as much visual noise as possible. Creating rocks is something that's definitely outside of my skill set. It's a different discipline entirely. So I collaborated with an artist called Bram Zwicker and gave him some measurements for 3D models that could be broadly applicable and very reusable. And I think he did an excellent job in the end. It was really a nice milestone when we finally had rocks in the game and could dress all these different slopes so they didn't look like hot garbage anymore. I've mentioned building blocks before, and when it comes to games, you can do a lot with just a few of these building blocks. Rocks are an excellent example for that. You can take one cliff model and just duplicate and scale and rotate it randomly in order to create one large rock formation. But there's always a case of a hierarchy there. You can't take this gigantic 3D model of a cliff and then just scale it down to a pebble. It doesn't really look well, and it's not efficient either. So we still needed a way to bridge these big models with the terrain. And that wasn't really possible until Danique joined the team, who created these smaller scaled rocks and rubble and pebbles, and that really helped up fill the gap. What you see here is quite an exaggerated example, but I hope it illustrates my point. It was really nice to have these in the game, because they weren't for maybe a year or so. Here you can see the difference rocks eventually made in the game. Terrain itself, it's not capable of having very fine detail, so augmenting it with these rock structures was really beneficial. And in terms of like Oregon style rocks, I think in the end rocks really ended up being more of an artistic interpretation rather than being realistic, but I think that it counts for a lot of the game world. And that kind of brings me to a subject I wanted to talk about as well, which is the art style and how it came to be. Now, at the start of the project, there was no clear definition of what we were going for. And at the time, I was the only artist on the team. So thankfully, I was given a lot of freedom to explore this. And one thing I set my mind on was that I wanted to avoid realism. First and foremost, because it seems pretty uninteresting and it's always an unachievable goal because you can never hit true realism. And secondly, creating very realistic and accurate game assets, it really increases production load. We were quite a small team. I figured we had a lot of content to create in order to fill in the world, so that wasn't really achievable. And here you can see one of the first artists that I made, and it looks completely different from how the game currently looks. It was very toony still, like cartoony, which was still on my mind. A few months prior, I had created this fantasy environment, and that's where my heart still lied, so it was difficult to shake, next to the fact that it was also a comfort zone. But Lake isn't a fantasy game. It has connections to real world themes and locations, so that created a sort of mismatch. So I experimented with creating more detailed branch textures and using more natural colors and lighting. And I definitely wanted to avoid adding too much visual noise, some of which was introduced, but I think it panned out quite well. And it created an art style and vibe that matched the beats of the narrative and the tone that we were going for much better. And shortly after, I added a very popular plugin to the engine, which takes care of day-night cycles, weather effects, sounds, volumetric clouds, the whole shebang. And this stayed in the game for quite some time. But I noticed along the way it started affecting the art style. It had effectively changed from a more stylized interpretation to something that was very realistic in terms of lighting. And it pretty much looked way too generic. And I no longer had like this passion for the project because it wasn't really speaking to me on like an artistic level. I was working on creating these large trees, and I noticed that I had really hit a creative ceiling. I wasn't able to push their aesthetics the way I wanted to. Everything was too realistic. It was bound by all of these physically accurate lighting models, and for instance, changing the sky would require changing the entire composition of the atmosphere through like wavelengths and stuff. So achieving like a peachy sunrise or slightly cyan night sky just wasn't in there. I decided to just throw everything out, not worry about being able to keep any changes or version control, and just light a scene as I would do it normally. And these screenshots are the result of that experiment. I just wanted to see, despite any like technical implementation or limitations, I just wanted to see what it could look like, where it could go. And it was a lot more vibrant and characteristic. And I think that was a huge milestone in terms of the art style, because it gave a whole new direction. As time progressed, there was some desire voiced to have dynamic lighting in the game. It would add more variety to a single workday. The after-work events would have better context, seeing as they're actually set in the evening. But technically, I had no clear notion on how to approach this. Couldn't find any references to how other games did this, and using the same plugin as before, it would just be back to square one. It wouldn't provide the artistic freedom that I needed to create the images I was going after. So essentially I wanted dynamic lighting, but I also wanted to be able to achieve the fixed lighting that I initially made. That was the end goal. Around that time I was doing some freelance work on another project, which I can probably not name, but they had a similar request. They had these different scenes, and each scene would be played at a different time of day. So I set out to create a sort of preset settings system in which you have just all the bells and whistles you need for lighting right in front of you, and these settings could just be saved to like a nighttime or noon profile. and it would just be very easy to load those back in whenever you need them. And this provided a lot of nice fine detail artistic control. So I figured it would be pretty straightforward to just take all of these settings and blend between them over a timeline. So I set out to create such a system, and there was still a lot of technical work that went into it in order to make it user-friendly, like an artist tool. But I had validated my idea. It seemed to work out pretty well. So I put that on the back burner for a while until I started incorporating it into Lake. And the result was quite striking. It added a lot of unique character to the game and a lot of variety to a single day. And we had best of both worlds. Every time of day point was carefully authored to look just the way we wanted to, while still having all the benefits of dynamic lighting. And the one subject that was introduced was clouds. We didn't really have them, and they're quite important, seeing as they're mostly white, so they act as a sort of canvas for the lighting. If you have a clear sky outside and you have a low-hanging sun, the only real difference you're going to see is the color of the sky itself. But once you add clouds to that, a sunset becomes much more spectacular. And I wanted to avoid fancy volumetric clouds and such, mainly because the technical implementation, I wasn't familiar with it, and I did not want to add a huge performance cost to the game. So I ended up with a method where I could still use flat, old school clouds, but give them some information of curvature and depth so they could still look like they were 3D clouds. Dynamic weather was something that was added later because it could match certain narrative beats and add even more variety to a workday. But a challenge was that seeing as we have all these different time of day, lighting settings, they all need to look good in whatever weather conditions you throw at them. So that's potentially infinite combinations. Each one of them needs to look artistically crafted, so to speak. So it needed to be very simplified design. And during this time, I started paying more attention to weather, watching time-lapse footage, and I noticed that clouds always seem to be at the forefront of weather, not taking wind into account. Naturally, if you're going to have very thick, dark clouds over your head, eventually it's going to rain. So the clouds we had in the game at that point, they couldn't really do that, so they needed to transition from just a clear sky all the way down to stormy clouds. And lighting is also influenced by weather. Naturally, if you have an overcast sky, you're not going to see as much sunlight. So this was also factored in, and eventually we had a very nice uniformed lighting system with weather laid on top of that. And I think it panned out rather well. There were some doomsday combinations where, like, if it's raining and there's a sunset, the clouds just look like they're on fire. So at some points we had to make the game just start like 30 minutes later in order to avoid that, because it was quite complex. But in the end, I'm very happy about it, and I think it panned out rather well and adds a lot of variety into the game. I found this build from February 2019, so that's like 2 years ago now. Seems strange, but I think it highlights some interesting development points. This was before a revision of the town. Right now you can see Main Street is just one long line, but visually it did not work very well. It was also very noticeable to see all the content being loaded in the background. So we introduced a more organic curve in the street, and this brought forth another challenge. Because when I was looking at reference photos from this town called Sisters in Oregon, I noticed the sidewalks, they have very organic shapes and have all these indentations for parking grounds, and all these large parking lots, they had all these organic shapes and transitions, because logically all this stuff was specifically built for these locations. As you can see here in these residential areas, they have a lot of organic curves and paths that naturally transition into like these lawns and driveways, and it was particularly difficult to do because we essentially had no way of doing this. So this brought forth an in-engine tool that would allow us to create all of these organic shapes right within the environment, because that was particularly important. You needed to know where a road would end, or if there was an obstruction there. Everything needed to match closely. And I think in the end it really did wonders for the residential areas, which wouldn't have looked as residentially, so to speak, as they do now without any of these tools. And finally, another improvement that was added in this version of the game were these backdrop mountains. And they're originally something I sketched into the map because I figured they would be great at conveying a larger scale. Mountains generally are very majestic, especially if they're snow covered. But in an earlier version of the game, they really didn't pop that much. They didn't have enough detail or fidelity or even character to begin with. So after these were added, immediately the skyline, so to speak, or the lakeside vistas were elevated to a whole new level, and I'm super satisfied with it. The larger one, well, you don't often get the chance to name a mountain, and I wanted to have some sort of homage to the Native Americans that inhabited Oregon. So I was looking through their folklore, trying to find a name for this mountain that sort of resonated with the game. Eventually, I just called it Mount Awesome because I was unable to find anything matching. But in the end, it's not referenced anywhere in the game, but it's called Providence Peak. It's named after the town, or the other way around, kind of a chicken and an egg thing. So I think I've covered pretty much all of my material. There were probably some gaps, particularly regarding building the map, because frankly I can't remember all the fine details, but I don't think it matters too much. There was probably still a wealth of technical detail I could have gone into, but it would just end up being jargon and like hand waving about shaders and stuff. So far the reception for Lake has been quite wonderful. There have even been some people who say it really reminds them of Oregon, and personally that's really all I could wish for. If you're looking forward to the game, please consider wishlisting it. It may not seem to make much of a difference, but it really goes a long way. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.